This is In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. During the month of May, we're celebrating families, and this week's guest carries on a unique musical legacy. I'm speaking about vocalist Lila Ammons. While she began her career as an opera singer, she now focuses much of her time on the art form of jazz. In fact, it's a sort of family tradition for her. Her grandfather was pianist Albert Ammons, and her uncle was saxophonist Gene Ammons. Lila shares how she discovered their own stories, and it was those discoveries that helped influence her own musical sound. Here's Lila Ammons. Why is family important to you?
First, the obvious reasons. Family is really important because as an artist, it's really helpful to have a foundation and people in your life who, I think, who know you and who are there for you, because when you go out into the world, it's tough. It's very competitive. You have a lot of disappointments and you're traveling. And as I traveled, the one thing that really made me feel good was knowing that somewhere in the world, there are some people who really know me, and that really that really helps me a lot to keep me moving forward. And I would get a birthday card from a couple of my brothers and a really good friend of mine from childhood. The three of them would always send birthday cards to me and my friend to my parents and say, wherever Lila is in the world, would you please forward this to her? And that was so meaningful to me because it was such a competitive and stressy and a lot of hard work. And sometimes you had your extremely high moments, and then sometimes you had your extreme lows. So for me, it's just a foundation that kept me going.
So let's begin with your story as it relates to family. Where were you born, Lila?
Chicago, Illinois.
Tell me about your immediate family growing up. Did your parents, and did you have any siblings?
Yes, my mom and dad, and I had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I was the youngest of 6. Everyone in my family was musical and loved music. My oldest sister, Marilyn, was a child prodigy on the piano. She was a classical pianist and was a prodigious player. And my earliest memory was of my sister playing. And I remember when I was 3, she would play Rachmaninoff and Beethoven, Bach fugues. She was playing the Beethoven Pathétique and all of this just beautifully at the age of 12, After they would all go to school, I never went to school with any of my siblings. I would sit and start picking at the piano. I had those melodies in my head, and I would try to do those melodies, And that's when my mother peered around the corner, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, is that you playing?" And she started telling people that, I think she might have some abilities here because she's picking this music out. So my sister Marilyn, I would say, was my first inspiration. But everyone in my family played instruments. My parents, my dad really loved opera, and we would listen to that. And he liked jazz. And my mother was really into classical music. And I got to tell you, I learned so much music through my older brothers and sisters. There was never a quiet moment or a moment I wasn't either listening to some music. And a lot of it was to their credit because they introduced me to a lot of it.
And there were also 2 additional influences in your musical family, both of them well known in the jazz sphere. We're speaking, of course, of your grandfather, Albert Ammons, who was a talented pianist, and your uncle, Gene Ammons, who was well known for his work on the tenor sax. How close were you with both of them?
Really, I didn't know Albert at all because he died in 1949. And so that was, a decade before I was born. And then Gene, we got to know Gene really towards the end of his life. Interestingly enough, my dad used to play. He would play the Carnegie Hall, and I used to see the Carnegie Hall album from 1938, the John Hammond production. And I was curious about that. He never talked about it. And I saw the name, and I'm 3, 4, 5 years old, And then So I kind of had an idea that about this person, and sometimes Dad would play Gene, and then he also played Sarah Vaughan, and he loved Earl Garner, and he and my mom would dance, and that was the thing that for me was most exciting, is that whenever they would play jazz music, oh, good, Mom and Dad are going to dance, so, so I enjoyed that, but we really didn't know a lot about the legacy, because my parents tried very hard to protect us from the risks of the field, the alcohol and drugs. And unfortunately, Albert, Grandpa, he liked his, I think it was bourbon he liked. And my dad said, I used to try to tell Dad not to drink. Come on, Dad, and he liked his bourbon. But Gene, unfortunately, through the bebop generation, which he came up in, and he unfortunately got caught up a bit in the hard drugs, and was actually the second time set up. It was a setup, and it was very. It's now historically it's been documented that he was falsely set up, but he ended up with a 7-year detention. He was in the penitentiary for 7 years. And so my parents were very weary. They were afraid that we might get caught up in that. So I learned later in life, and in high school, I really started knowing about Gene. And my dad invited him over, and we got to know him. We just hung on his every word and saw him at the Chicago Theater, and saw his charisma. He walked out on stage, and 2,000, 3,000 people all stood up. He was just amazing presence. So we didn't get to know him that well, but I'm so glad that we did get that contact with him. He was really pleased that I was playing piano at the time, and violin, and I was myself really thinking of pursuing music, and he was very happy about that. So now I understand that legacy. And when I was in New York as an opera singer at the Manhattan School of Music studying for my master's, I became interested in my legacy. And I remember my dad had a book called The Left Hand Like God. And I found that book in a bookstore that I used to go to, a used bookstore on Broadway. And I said, that looks like the book Dad had at home. Excuse me. So I picked it up, and I saw John Hammond's picture on the back. And I said, wow, I'm going to see if he's still at Columbia Records. And this was like 1983, 2. And I called Columbia and asked for him. And the young lady says, oh, I think he has an office somewhere in the back. She didn't even really know how important he was. And sure enough, he picked up the phone. And John Hammond was the big impresario who discovered a lot of people. My grandfather, Aretha Franklin, Billie Holiday, many people were discovered by John Hammond. And Barney Josephson owned the Cafe Society, and Albert played there a lot. So I kind of looked into my heritage through them, and they agreed to meet with me. And I sat and talked with them, and they told me a lot about Albert. And they talked about Billie, the first time she sang Strange Fruit, and that whole lead up to her singing that. Just incredible stories. I'm sitting there, and they're reliving all of their life with me sitting there, and they're telling me all of this. He discovered Bruce Springsteen, all kinds of people. So that really, in the back of my mind at that time, I said, when I finish this foray in this opera, I'm going to go and do what's really in my heart and soul, and I wanted to do jazz. And so several years later, I turned back to that.
And it's amazing to hear the stories of those who came from the past in the history of jazz. And you mentioned, both your grandfather and your uncle having, having their own vices in life. And it's interesting. You hear so many of these stories of brokenness, of struggle, of strife. But to hear, for instance, your uncle's saxophone stylings. I believe there was a recording he did called "You Are Laughing at Me," and to hear the expression, I'm always amazed that out of the darkness of life there is such light that comes out of it. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole thing about the blues. I mean, it's that there's always a deep faith and determination to overcome whatever it is that you're going through, and I think the blues addresses that. And some people don't understand, they don't understand how that can happen. It's a survival mechanism, and it's also very good to face what you're going through, to talk about it. And that's what the blues lets you do. It lets you express what you're feeling and let it go. And now it's out in the air, and it goes and it's gone, and then people who are listening can relate to it. It relates stories of things that they've gone through, But there is a triumphal thing that's happening at the same time as people are doing these blues. Like I said, there's a spirit, like you're saying and suggesting. There is a spirit that is impenetrable, that permeates that music,
I know that much of your classical training still helps to inform your jazz vocalizing. In fact, even when I listen to an up-tempo swing or maybe something with a Latin beat, when I listen to your breathing and your intonation, I can still hear those fundamentals that you learned as an opera singer. And some people say, well, there is a distinct difference between classical and jazz, but I love to think of how one informs the other. You were in New York for how many years? Remind me of that.
About 13 years, really, trying to be on that opera track. And I studied voice for over 20 years. Regardless of where I was in terms of career and life and where I wanted to go in life, the one thing I always told myself was to continue taking voice lessons. And so I did, even at times when I wasn't sure if I wanted to do the classical anymore. After doing some, I was with Miami Opera for a couple of years, and then I went to Philly. And I traveled from Philly to New York every week to study with a particular teacher that I liked, and eventually moved back to New York. But I always said, I don't want to be in a situation where 5 years from now, I decide I want to sing again, and it's like, now I got to get myself back in shape,
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So I always kept the voice going at all times. And once I finally decided, after my mother passed away, and I thought about it, I said, I think I'm going to stop here and reevaluate. I did move to Minneapolis, Minnesota, because one of my brothers was here, and he really wanted me to move here, although I was on my way to California. And I still did classical for 2 more years. There was a wonderful teacher here, and I worked with her for 2 years and sang Bach and was in the Bach Society, and I was doing oratorio. And again, as I did that for a couple of years, I really knew I was done. I was done. I didn't want the life anymore. I wanted more freedom. I wanted to explore myself more and not be at the mercy of a conductor or at the mercy of something that's written on a page, although I still love it. And the challenge really is about the voice. It's all about the voice. And I still have a high regard for that. But I needed more room to express myself. And so I slowly made the transition into jazz and had to learn how to sing with a mic.
Instead of, say, belting out to the, what is it my voice teacher used to say? Mr. Forrest used to say something like, he says, you're not going to have a microphone if you're on the stage of the Met. He says, you've got to belt so they can hear you in the family section without any trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
Family section, nosebleed section. That's exactly right. You are the amplifier. Your body is the amplifier. And so I'm singing here. I'm trying to get this thing going. I'm sitting in with people. I mean, I just at scratch didn't know much at all, and I just came and I said, I'm just going to learn this, you know. And and then I remember someone hearing me a couple years into that and saying, she's starting to sound okay. And he said, you know, I told my friend about you. And I said, oh, really? He said, yeah. And you know what he asked me? I said, what? He says, is she still singing real loud?
and what did your friend say to his friend?
He said, no, she's kind of getting it, you know.
Yeah, people comment after my gigs. People do comment to me, well, we'll give you this, Jay. Have no trouble hearing it. You're pretty loud. So maybe I should think about that, shouldn't I, Lila?
Well, you know what helped me, Jay? I had early on, I had this inkling to do some recording, which I had started in New York, actually. And I wanted to do some recording. So I went to one of the finest recording studios here in town. And these wonderful musicians were so great. They said they'd do it, you know. And when I went back in to do some voiceovers, the engineer spent the afternoon with me. And I worked out my mic technique in that studio. And I figured out how to place my voice. Okay. And then I started to get it, you know. But the classical, definitely, I would not take it back for a moment because it has given me longevity.
You mentioned that the reason that you wanted to sing jazz was not solely to explore and express, but there were two words that you use that we hear a lot with regard to musical expression. You said jazz was your heart and soul. What do you mean by that?
I just, I feel the rhythm. I feel the swing. I love the camaraderie that happens on the bandstand with the other musicians. And it just feels freeing to me, you know, and then the more I learn and the more I get into, you know, the swing and posts and then bebop, I really have discovered I love bebop and post bop and hard bop. And it's just, 50s, 60s, the later jazz is really resonating for me. So it's just, I don't know, it is deep. And I think it might be because there's a blues connection. And I think my years of singing classic blues in Europe for 9 years and touring extensively, singing classic blues and boogie woogie, I started to really get jazz. It's that foundation, and you're always finding that rhythm. You're finding where, in between those beats, there's a feeling that's there. And so I do feel I have a passion. I do have a passion now.
When you approach a song, whether it's a vocalist treatment, say like Nika's Dream that you did on Genealogy, or maybe it's a well-known standard, say a Stardust or something that's up-tempo, you've explored some of the adjustments that you had to make, transitioning from a primarily classical performance technique to jazz. And there are some differences. But if you are approaching the microphone and you're singing before an audience, what is the greatest challenge that you face when it's time for you to deliver that song to the audience?
Earlier on, I was self-conscious about authenticity, and then, I've done a lot of listening. There are so many people I admire, and, that has helped me a lot. And I think also one of the things that I found was difficult to my mind was that I didn't immediately identify with any one singer. There wasn't one singer that I thought, and I think because I also, forayed into the opera, there's kind of a disconnect. But earlier in my life, I listened to so many great singers, from Aretha to Barbra Streisand to Sarah Vaughan, Joni Mitchell, you name it. There were just so many singers that I listened to that resonated. For Nancy Wilson, And each one of them had something that was so amazing to me. And so I couldn't really decide, oh, I'm going to go with Dinah Washington. She's got that blues in there. Then I would listen to Dionne Warwick and like Herbert Bacharach, So I didn't identify with any one person. So I ended up being this synthesis of different styles, including my classical. And so I think at first I was a little bit thinking, gosh, I don't really sound like anyone. Are they going to like this? But, I've come to appreciate that. And when I started to connect with the music, just connect with the music, and started to get into those lyrics and started to say to myself, what does this really mean for me when I sing this? Things started to turn for me. So as long as I have warmed up, I have practiced, well enough, and I'm prepared, I really don't have nothing debilitating. I still always have that excitement, always when I step on stage. I always have that excitement. And whenever that's gone, then I know, oh, this is going to be a flat night, But I just think about communicating a message to people. And my greatest hope is that it does reach people in some kind of way.
And how do you communicate your own story through your songs?
It's how I think of the lyric, and then I find my story, and then in each phrase, even the word, the sentence, what's in the sentence, what word is really the most important in this sentence? What really gives this meaning? I went to the, I went to the store. I went to the store. I mean, what is really most important? And I think that comes out in your phrasing, how you interpret the words. And so I started just focusing on that and not worrying, oh my gosh, am I doing enough of delay here? Am I doing enough there? Because of course, being classically trained, you have all these obsessions.
Hey, yes. Hold the note. Yeah. If it calls for holding it out for the entire measure, you hold it for the entire measure. Yeah.
Yeah. There's all these things, and and also vocally, and so I had to let some of that go. I had to undo some of that, and then I started to realize my diction has to change. I didn't have to think, it's very clear, our love is here to stay. I didn't have to overly enunciate anymore. It's very clear, our love is here to stay. It's here to stay, not here to stay. Here to stay. That's what I tell my kids that are trying to sing this music. I said, hey, you have to get into like you're having a conversation. Okay, you got to be more conversational when you're doing this stuff. So I started discovering that, how can I make it sound more what is it that I need to do for it to be more authentic?
And it's not easy. Not at all.
Not at first, but then after a while you start, okay, now I get it, and again, I tell them also, keep listening to people. Listen to Billie Holiday. What made her so great? What is it about Lorez Alexandria? Why was she so great, even though the world doesn't know enough about her, in my opinion? But why was she so great? And that makes you really start to listen in a different kind of way, because when I was younger, I didn't care for Billie Holiday because I was a singer. I liked the voices. I was into the voice. And then when I started to mature and understand more about blues and jazz, I understood her brilliance.
It's looking beyond what is simply heard or seen on the surface.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we started off this conversation talking about some of the influences upon your own music. And we began with family, with your grandfather, Albert, with your uncle, Gene. How do you feel that you are carrying on their legacy through your work?
Well, for one thing, as I mentioned before, for about from 2007 to about 2019, I was touring Europe with a very well-known boogie woogie specialist by the name of Axel Svingenberger. He's from Germany, Hamburg, Germany, and he loved my uncle's music. And in 2007, we had met years ago, and in 2007, he and I were corresponding, and he reminded me that 2007 was the 100th anniversary of Albert's birth. And so after learning as much as I did about Albert and all the wonderful things he did, playing for Truman's inauguration, doing the Carnegie Hall, his playing at Cafe Society, and all the wonderful Harry James and all the different people that he was playing with, Lux Lewis, Pete Johnson, Sippy Wallace. And I just was looking at all of his accomplishments, and I called my brother one day, and I said, "Gosh, I'm learning so much about Albert. I wish we could celebrate him. I want more people to know who he was." So in 2007, I, with the help of Axel and several old guys here in the U.S. who knew a lot of these old boogie woogie players, and they were amateur players, but they were very informed, helped to connect me to an international group of boogie woogie players. And I put together a concert in Chicago at the Chicago Temple, September 23rd, 2007. And we had almost 400 people there. And it really, really was an amazing evening. And after that, I started getting invitations from people to perform with them. And then Axel said, "Hey, would you like to tour with me?" So, because he had toured with Sippy Wallace, Big Joe Turner, he had recorded with a lot of the old, he was one of those people who recorded with a lot of the old blues people before they passed on. And he documented with concerts with them. So I celebrated Albert for 9 or 10 years, pretty consistently. And then Gene, I think the fact that I honor them when I am performing in some way or another, it's either it's the style that they performed in, or it's something that they actually played, I will honor them in some way that way. And then I look to the future. I say, okay, well, what can I add to this? But I always do beckon and hearken back to their style. So I'm kind of known as a singer that is kind of a historical singer. I will bring in different genres, historical styles within a show. And so people have kind of started thinking of me in that way. So I guess in a sense, that's how I celebrate them. And I'm trying to keep people aware of their legacy. And that's why I did my last album is entitled Genealogy. And Gene's name is in that. And I thought, that's the name of this album,
Yeah.
So I'm celebrating them, celebrating blues. I took that Billy Eckstine tune and kind of made it into a barrel house blues. It's really not. It's really a slow, almost ballad blues done by Billy Eckstine. So I was trying to show different, by having Thelonious Monk in this kind of forward arrangement of Monk, which is kind of a little bit of hip hop kind of rhythm that's going on in there to show where jazz is going. So I have swing, where it came from, blues, swing, and, post bop, hard bop. And then I've got this Monk arrangement just to show kind of a little bit of progression and an appreciation for jazz music.
One final thought. Why music?
I'll tell you why. Because when I was that 3-year-old, I tell you the thing about Chicago that was so wonderful. We were exposed to so much wonderful music and art and nature there, and it was very inspirational. And somehow I knew at that early age that music, it did something to me and for me. It was a refuge. And I spent many, 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 many hours and years as a child, just listening to music. So when I got older, and I studied piano and violin, and I was always singing in choirs, and, went to college, and junior year decided, okay, what do I really want to do? And when I thought about it, I said, what's the most consistent thing in my life? It was music. I said, what's the thing I know the best? I know how to do the best. It was music. So I always knew that somehow it was always going to be a big part of my life, and there was no contest. And it has been like that ever since.
Lila Ammons, this week's guest during In Studio from Simply Timeless. I encourage you to check out our website, that address, LilaAmmonsmusic.com. Thanks so much, Lila, for taking the time to visit with us and share some of your family stories. We look forward to the next opportunity. Thanks also to you, our listener, for making the time to listen. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels. Thanks for listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless.